All right, everybody, welcome to part 2 of the central nervous system lecture, where we're going to discuss the spinal cord. So we're going to talk about some major structures in the spinal cord, discuss the meninges, talk about some of the different horns and their responsibilities, and also differentiate descending and ascending tracts, and then finally we'll end with some spinal cord injuries and diseases. So the spinal cord is the structure that is enclosed within the vertebral column, and it begins all the way up at the foramen magnum, which is that giant hole on the base of the skull. And each level of the spinal cord gives rise to what we call spinal nerves. So up here we can see these little sort of projections coming off of the spinal cord. These are the cervical spinal nerves. We'll have the thoracic spinal nerves, lumbar spinal nerves, and sacral spinal nerves. In addition to having these nerves, we're also going to have enlargements in certain areas of the spinal cord. So you can see that this section of the spinal cord is quite thick compared to maybe this section. And so this is called the cervical enlargement. And then we also have the lumbar enlargement. Finally, the spinal cord terminates at the section called the conus medullaris, which is down here. And the cauda equina is all of this section here. And then this little green structure that you see kind of coming down is called the filum terminale. And we're going to talk about each of these structures in more detail. So in terms of spinal nerves, as we were just discussing, spinal nerves are part of the peripheral nervous system. And these are attached to the spinal cord by 31 paired roots. And so if you kind of come over to this picture, this is a anatomy dissection of the spinal cord. You can see all of these sort of structures out here to the side. And these are representing spinal nerves coming off of the spinal cord. Okay, and you can see that's true down in the thoracic region as well. And in the lumbar region. Okay. So every single spinal cord segment is going to be designated by paired spinal nerves that are arising from it. So basically what I mean by that is that we're going to talk about, I'm just going to draw one section here just to make it easier. Okay. Within, I should put it in a place where there's not already a box, huh? Okay. Within this box now you see there's this middle structure, which is part of the spinal cord, and then it's branching off in two different directions and passing through this protective layer that's in this purple layer and going and leaving in between two vertebrae. So actually, this section here and here, you can see the two vertebrae, and the spinal nerve is coming out in between the two vertebrae. Okay. So the cervical and the lumbosacral enlargements are designated in the cervical region and also in the lumbar region. And basically, these regions are particularly enlarged. They're much bigger areas of the spinal cord in terms of their width here, because this is where all the nerves that serve the upper limbs and the lower limbs emerge from. Okay, so these particular regions would have a lot higher density of nerves coming from them in this area, because we have to spit out a whole bunch of nerves to go on and serve the arm, right? And the same situation down here, we have to spit out a lot of nerves to go on and serve the legs. Okay, so these particular regions then are regions that are going to be a lot thicker compared to other regions. So the next structure that I will highlight is the conus medullaris, which you'll see down here. And essentially, what this looks like, it's kind of hard to tell based on this picture, but pretty much the spinal cord comes down to a point like that. And then it's got just some extra loose nerves kind of hanging off of it. But this point that it comes down to is called the conus medullaris. Okay, so it comes down to this sort of tip-like point. All right, and that region, that tip-like point region here, is the conus medullaris. And usually this is approximately at the level of L1, L2. So the spinal cord is ending at around L1, L2. And you can see the conus medullaris much better over here in the picture of the cadaver anatomy. So you can see it there where it's coming to a point. Okay. So again, conus medullaris is the point where the spinal cord is ending, which is usually around L1 or L2. Okay, and knowing that is important and will be important throughout the lecture. So the next structure is the cauda equina, which is the structures sort of just below the conus medullaris. And cauda equina literally means horsetail. And so this structure is called the horsetail because it kind of looks like a horse's tail. So the cauda equina is, again, this portion at the inferior part. So basically all of that, just below the conus medullaris, and in the cadaver image over here. And I have to say that speaking from experience, this is a very accurate picture of what the cauda equina looks like. It really is it's an amazing looking structure in the human body. So the final structure here that we'll talk about is the phylum terminale. And in this picture, we see the phylum terminale as green, but it's not actually green in the human body. They just made it green so that you can like see it, and that just know that it basically starts up here at the conus medullaris and it travels all the way. So it starts up here at conus medullaris and it travels all the way down to the coccyx, where it's going to insert onto the coccyx. And so basically it's like the string that anchors the spinal cord in place and keeps it in its nice column-like structures here. And additionally, it's pretty much just an extension of the conus, and it's covered with pia mater. So in our picture over here on the cadaver image, the phylum terminale would be this sort of thicker band here. Okay, so if I like put a stamp on there, okay, be that structure there. So now that we've talked about some of the basic structures, let's talk about protection of the spinal cord. So first and foremost, it's big time protected because it is actually inside of bone, right? So we know it's present inside of the vertebra, which gives it big time protection. In addition, we have several meninges that keep it safe in its place. And so first and foremost is the epidural space, which is going to be the fat containing space we see here, right? All of this fat containing space. Next, in terms of, so I'm going to go from most superficial to the deepest. So we're going to have, first and foremost, as I just mentioned, the epidural space. Okay. And then deep to the epidural space, we are going to see the dura mater. And so the dura mater then would be this gray colored structure that is surrounding the vertebra, just deep to the epidural space. And so if I put a stamp on there, oops. That stamp is now pointing to the dura. Okay. And it's important to know that in the spinal cord, notice the dura is only one layer thick, but up in the brain, it had two different layers. The next structure would be the subdural space, which would be this purple outlined area that's just beneath the dura mater. So if I put a dot on it, if I can. Okay. All right, so I'm gonna just talk about this in sort of a different way. I'm gonna draw something out for you guys, and hopefully this will make things a little bit easier. Okay. So okay, so I just drew a little picture to just try and explain this a little bit better. The picture on the PowerPoint is kind of small, so I just drew this up really quick to hopefully get this sort of nailed down. So the brown outline that you see here is showing the vertebra. And the first layer of protection that we see along the spinal cord, so the spinal cord is going to be this yellow structure here in the middle. The first layer, the superficial layer that we see, is the epidural space. And the epidural space is going to be this fat-filled space that basically cushions up against the vertebra. And then deep to the epidural space, we'll find the dura mater. Just below the dura mater, we're going to find the subdural space, which is a hollowed out space that you see in orange here. And so the subdural space literally means below the dura. Okay, and so just after the subdural space, we will find the arachnoid mater, and that's indicated in white here. Okay. Just deep to the arachnoid mater, we'll have the subarachnoid space. Okay, so subarachnoid meaning below the arachnoid mater. And the subarachnoid space is where we will find cerebrospinal fluid circulating. Okay, and so just in between then the arachnoid mater and the spinal cord, we have this other layer indicated here in purple, and this purple layer is the pia mater, and the pia mater sits directly on top of the spinal cord and protects it most directly. All right, so I just wanted to kind of try and give you a better picture of these different layers of protection and spaces in more of a blown up scenario. So I just threw this together really quick to hopefully help you with that. Okay, so excuse me, going back to this slide, we talked about the epidural space then being that sort of fatty layer. Then we have the dura, and then we would have the subdural space, followed by the arachnoid mater, followed by the subarachnoid space, followed by the pia mater. And one thing I would like to point out with the pia mater is that we have these little extensions of the pia mater called denticulate ligaments. And the denticulate ligaments are responsible for securing the spinal cord to the dura mater. So we can see these little sort of white fibers within this network here. All of these are denticulate ligaments that are anchoring the spinal cord to the dura mater so that it stays nice and secure. And then finally, as I mentioned before, the cerebrospinal fluid is going to be in that subarachnoid space and functions to cushion and protect the structures of the spinal cord. So I just want to point out here a clinical connection that we can make to this is something called a lumbar puncture. And I bring this up because even though I mentioned before that the spinal cord ends at approximately L2 or L3, right? So spinal cord ends L2 to L3, all right? But the dura, the arachnoid, and the pia mater, for all intents and purposes, all of those membranes actually extend all the way down to the sacrum. So they're extending, those protective coverings are extending beyond the end of the spinal cord. And so for this reason, this is below, so basically anywhere below L3 and before the sacrum is where we're going to perform, if necessary, what's called a lumbar puncture. And sometimes the lumbar puncture is also called a spinal tap. And usually a lumbar puncture occurs between L4 and L5 vertebra. So here would be L4 spinous process, and here's L5 spinous process. And so what happens is you will stick a needle in between the vertebra until it reaches the subarachnoid space. Okay, we want it to reach the subarachnoid space. All right, and we want it to reach that space because the subarachnoid space is the space where we find cerebrospinal fluid. So my question to you is, why would we do a lumbar puncture? And things you might be thinking about, hopefully, should be, we want to test this cerebrospinal fluid if we suspect, for example, maybe we suspect some sort of infection. Okay, we suspect infection, then we will find bacteria or whatever in the cerebrospinal fluid. Other things, maybe we suspect some sort of bleed somewhere, maybe a brain bleed, maybe specifically maybe a brain bleed. If that's true, we're going to find red blood cells in the cerebrospinal fluid, which normally shouldn't be there. Okay, so all of these could be potential reasons for doing a lumbar puncture. But I also just want to point out one more thing, and that is the location of this lumbar puncture or spinal tap. Again, both meaning the same thing. Location is very important. You wouldn't want to do this lumbar puncture any higher because you run the risk of puncturing the actual spinal cord, which can cause damage. So the location where it's sort of quote unquote safe to do this lumbar puncture is somewhere below where the end of the spinal cord has terminated, and in a space that is a pretty open space for getting the cerebrospinal fluid. So right now, maybe you're thinking, you've heard of lumbar punctures, but maybe you're also considering the fact that maybe you've heard of an epidural. Okay, so an epidural would be something that, I mean, most commonly pregnant women going through labor get an epidural. And so I just wanted to point out the differences between the lumbar puncture and the epidural. So from the pictures here on the left picture, this one is a lumbar puncture. Okay. Whereas the picture over here on the right is showing a epidural. Now, what you might notice and what you should notice is where the needle is entering. So in a lumbar puncture, the needle is actually going through the dura mater into the subarachnoid space so that we can sample cerebrospinal fluid. On the contrary, an epidural is actually going to go into that epidural space. So remember a couple of slides ago, I talked about the epidural space is just that fatty space, the place where there's the fat just outside of the dura mater. So an epidural is actually, the needle is only going to enter that epidural space and is going to inject anesthetic into that epidural space. And the whole reason for doing an epidural is that by injecting anesthetic into this particular space, you're able to numb the nerve endings and the nerves that are coming out of the spinal cord at this particular level. And this is useful because if you numb the nerves, say from in this between L4 and L5, everything below that area will become numb. So all of the nerves that are innervating the structures of the abdomen, pelvis area, I should say, lower abdomen, pelvic area, and also legs become numb. All right, so this is usually both of them are administered as at the same level. So usually they're both administered between L4 and L5, but the degree to which the needle enters is different. So it would go deeper, the needle goes deeper for a lumbar puncture than for an epidural. Okay, and they really serve two different purposes. Okay, so let's talk about some cross-sectional anatomy of the spinal cord. So we have two different grooves that are going to run the length of the spinal cord, and these two different grooves serve to partially divide the spinal cord into left and right halves. And so we have the ventral or the anterior median fissure. Okay, so this one would be on the anterior side, we see here. And also we see here. Okay, so the ventral fissure be that little guy there and this little guy there. Okay. We also have a dorsal posterior median sulcus. Okay, so we have a fissure on the anterior side, and then we have a sulcus on the posterior side, or the dorsal side. Okay, and so that would be this here, and then you can sort of see it on this one, just not as well. In terms of location of gray matter and white matter, the gray matter in the spinal cord is located in the core, so this darker colored tissue that you see just around the central canal, right, and also this dark colored tissue that you see here. And then white matter is located outside of that core, so you can see the white matter located just outside of on the cervical region. It is just outside of this butterfly-shaped tissue. And then in the thoracic region, you can see it out here as well. Now, I just mentioned the central canal. So that's this little hole right here in the middle. And this little hole, it runs the entire length of the spinal cord and is also filled with cerebrospinal fluid. So talking a bit more about gray matter, the cross sections of the spinal cord sort of resemble either like a butterfly, or maybe you look at them as like the letter H. So letter H. All right. And there are three primary areas of gray matter. And so we have the dorsal horns, and the dorsal horns are composed of inner neurons that are going to receive sensory input from both somatic and visceral inputs. So just to highlight the location of the dorsal horn then, here and there. So those are the dorsal horns. And then we have the ventral horns, and the ventral horns also contain some interneurons, but they contain the somatic motor neurons. Okay, so just to spotlight those. Here. And there. Okay, so this top picture is the cervical region of the spinal cord, and then this bottom picture is the thoracic region of the spinal cord. So we said then that our dorsal horns are receiving sensory input from the organs and from skeletal muscle. The ventral horns are going to be containing motor neurons that go to skeletal muscle, so somatic motor neurons, so voluntary control motor neurons. And then finally, we have these lateral horns, and the lateral horns are special in that they contain sympathetic neurons. Okay, so neurons that are associated with the sympathetic nervous system. And as a note, you probably saw that I didn't draw around the lateral horns in the cervical region because there are none. All right, so these lateral horns are only present in the thoracic and superior lumbar regions. Okay, and again, these do sympathetic nervous control. Okay, so the sympathetic nervous system, which we'll be talking about in a couple of weeks. All right, so here is just a nice table that's summarizing the horns, what cell bodies are there, and then which nerve roots are associated with them. And so I'm just going to go back to this picture just for 1 second and kind of highlight. So we have I'm going to just focus on this top picture for a second. We're going to see that we have our dorsal horn here. And what you can see that little section coming off of the spinal cord? That is the dorsal root. Okay, and so on this bottom picture then, here is our dorsal horn and the dorsal root coming from that same side. All right, and we have the same situation with our lateral horns, or excuse me, our ventral horns. The ventral horns give rise to ventral roots. So if here is the ventral horns, just erase that other one here. So if those are the ventral horns, then you can see the nerve coming off of this side of the spinal cord. These would be the ventral roots, okay? And the ventral roots are formed by these little ventral rootlets, which again, they're coming straight out of projecting from the ventral horns of the spinal cord, okay? So let's talk a little bit more about this. Gray matter in the spinal cord is divided into 4 groups based on whether we're talking about somatic or visceral innervation. Okay, and so we have the somatic sensory section. Okay, and so somatic sensory, then, so we know this posterior side. So let me just write that on there so we're not confused anyway. So this side is posterior, this side is anterior, right? So this side's anterior. And within the dorsal horns, we have two areas. So one area is going to be the somatic sensory area. And so located in this area, we will have interneurons that receive input from somatic sensory neurons, okay? So somatic sensory neurons, for example, this one here in blue, it's going to come in to the spinal cord, synapse on these somatic sensory interneurons, okay? We also have in the dorsal horn these visceral sensory interneurons. And so in this case, visceral sensory neurons from out in the body are going to come, so this is the green one, it's going to come into the spinal cord and synapse on the visceral sensory interneurons located inside of the dorsal horn, okay? On the ventral side, the anterior side, we have motor neurons. So we have the somatic motor neurons. And so you can see those are the pink ones, which are going to send signals out to the body. Okay, and so direction of movement here for things on the motor side is out. Okay. And here's the location where those somatic motor neurons are located within the gray matter of the spinal cord. And then finally, we have the visceral motor or the autonomic neurons. And just like the motor neurons, the autonomic neurons are also going to be since they're a motor signal, they're sending information out to the body, okay, from the central nervous system out to the body. Now, for all intents and purposes, just to kind of make this full circle, and as a reminder, these sensory neurons, they're coming from the body and they're bringing information into the spinal cord, okay? So information is coming in to the spinal cord on the dorsal or posterior side, synapsing in their appropriate interneurons on the dorsal horns. That information gets integrated in one way or another, and then that information can be sent to the ventral horns where that signal, the motor signal, can be relayed out to the body. Okay, so stuff comes in, we integrate it, and then we send it out. Okay. So I've already mentioned these spinal roots, but I'm just going to touch a little bit more on them. They are bundles of neurons. And so our dorsal roots do sensory input into the cord. So they are going to be receiving sensory information and sending it into the spinal cord. Okay. And again, these roots, they're just collections of neurons. Now, we do have these things called ganglia, and ganglia are collections of cell bodies of the sensory neurons. Okay, so here we can see this big bulge, right? And we have one over on this side as well, right? That big bulge area. That is the dorsal root ganglia. And so the cell bodies of the sensory neurons sit inside of this ganglia and perform their functions. On the ventral side, the anterior side, right? So this, as a reminder for us, this side is anterior and this side is posterior. And so our ventral roots are bundles of motor neuron axons that are exiting the spinal cord, right? So we're sending signals out. Okay. Spinal nerves then are basically just when the sensory and the motor neurons meet up. Okay, so they are formed by the fusion of dorsal and ventral roots. So where they come together, where those roots come together, is actually what's making up spinal nerves. Okay. So knowing this, knowing that spinal nerves are a combination or the result of both the dorsal roots and the ventral roots coming together, then we should have it in our minds now that all spinal nerves are mixed nerves. And by mixed nerves, I mean they contain neurons, the axons of neurons of both sensory and motor neurons. So spinal nerves are the axons of both sensory and motor neurons. They have both pathways. They start to break up once we get into the spinal cord. But when they exit the spinal cord, so coming off of the spinal cord, going out to the body, these spinal nerves are mixed nerves, right? They have both sensory and motor function.
So now that we've talked about gray matter in the spinal cord, we're going to move on to talking about the white matter in the spinal cord. And in terms of white matter, both myelinated and non-myelinated nerve fibers are allowing the communication between parts of the spinal cord and between parts of the spinal cord and the brain. And so these fibers, they run in three directions. So they're either ascending fibers, and ascending fibers will run up to higher centers. So for example, running up to the brain. And you can see those are the blue fibers that you see in this top image. Anything blue is going to be a sensory input. Excuse me. So we're going to say blue is sensory. And we also have descending tracts or descending fibers. And the descending fibers run from the brain to the spinal cord or to lower cord levels. And so these are our motor outputs. All right, so anywhere that you see this sort of reddish pink colored areas are our motor outputs. Okay, so we see them in various areas here within the spinal cord itself. Additionally, we also have transverse fibers, and these transverse fibers, they're also called commissural fibers. These are the fibers that run from one side of the spinal cord to the other. So we might see some commissural fibers, for example, here. We have the gray commissural fibers. And in terms of the white matter, it's going to be divided into 3 columns. And these 3 columns are going to be located on each side. So we're going to have the dorsal columns, the dorsal funiculus. So here, we're going to have the lateral funiculus being here. And we're going to have the ventral funiculus here. Okay, so we have 3 major columns. Each tract, so each ascending tract and each descending tract, is going to be composed of axons that have similar destinations and similar functions. And so we're going to talk about each of these different tracts. So these major spinal tracts, they're part of this multi-neuron pathway. And there's 4 really important things to understand about the spinal tracts and pathways, and they are outlined here. So first and foremost is this idea of decussation. Basically, this means that at some point, most pathways are going to cross from one side of the central nervous system to the other. Okay? The term relay refers to the idea of a sort of chain action that's occurring between 2 or 3 neurons. So it's sort of this chain reaction up the spinal cord, much like a relay race, to relay the information. Additionally, we should understand that there is somatotopy occurring here. So there is a very precise spatial relationship in the central nervous system that corresponds to a specific area on the body. And we understood this to be true also in the brain, but just understand that this also occurs in, excuse me, the spinal cord as well. And then finally, the other point to be made here is that there is symmetry occurring. And so pathways along the spinal cord, they're paired symmetrically, meaning there's pathways running on the left side of the spinal cord and the right side of the spinal cord. So let's talk about these ascending pathways then. So our ascending pathways, as I've already mentioned, they conduct sensory input upward through a chain of 3 neurons. Okay, so this is kind of new information, but also very relevant. So our first order neurons are going to conduct the input from a cutaneous receptor and proprioceptors. It is going to branch as it enters the spinal cord or the medulla until eventually it synapses with a second order neuron. Okay, so I'm going to highlight that for you at this point. All right. Okay, so we're going to start down here on the bottom right. Our first order neuron is taking sensory information from our touch receptors. Here we see a first branch synapsing onto the spinal cord at this particular level, but that first order neuron still continues upwards. And continues upwards and till eventually it synapses in, we'll say in this case, in the medulla. Okay. So if you had a hard time following that, I'm going to now draw it in a thicker sort of outline here. Okay, so we have touch receptors. I'm going to draw it in red. Touch receptors bring the information into the spinal cord. And here we have our first branch, but that first order neuron continues upwards along its path until we reach the medulla. And this is where that first order neuron is going to synapse. Okay. This is first order neuron is going to synapse onto the second order neuron. Okay. So our first order neuron I drew down here in red, and it's going to synapse onto our second order neuron, which I am going to draw in green. Okay. Our second order neuron is going to be an interneuron, and it's going to be located in the cell body is going to be located in the dorsal horn on the spinal cord or in the medullary nuclei if we're talking about synapsing here in the medulla oblongata, which we have been. So we're just going to go along with this example. Okay, so the second order neuron is starting here where the first order neuron just synapsed, and it is going to travel upwards and extend until it reaches either the thalamus or the cerebrum. It just depends on which pathway we're talking about, but it's going to synapse in either one of those locations. So in our example, we are seeing that it synapses in the thalamus. Okay, so here's the synapse. All right. And then from here, the third order neuron, which I'll just draw in pink, the third order neuron is also an interneuron, and its cell bodies are in the thalamus, which is important because that's where the synapse of the second order neuron needs to occur. And so the axons then of this third order neuron are going to project to the somatosensory region of the cortex. Okay. Note, this is a very important thing that I'm about to tell you. There are no third order neurons in the cerebellum. Okay, no third order neurons in the cerebellum. Third order neurons are only up in the brain, specifically originating from the thalamus. Okay, so this is just a general overview of these ascending pathways, and now we're going to talk about the specific pathways. Okay, so we have 3 ascending pathways. The first one that we're going to talk about is the one that I just drew out for you on the last slide. So this is the dorsal column medial lemniscal pathway. And so this particular pathway transmits information for touch and for vibrations. And it's transmitting that information to the sensory cortex via the thalamus. And so this particular pathway is composed of paired cutaneous and gracilis in the spinal cord. and a medial lemniscus in the brain. Okay, so that medial lemniscus goes from the medulla to the thalamus. So for the dorsal column medial lemniscal pathway, we're entering the spinal cord, still first order neuron coming up and synapsing. If we're talking about a touch receptor, so if we're referring to information about touch, that's where you see this neuron coming from and going up and synapsing. But there's also neurons of first order neurons for the vibrations. Okay, so say that this is a vibration sensation here, and it will enter at the dorsal column, the dorsal pathway, go up until it synapses onto the second order neuron. This is the example. So in this example, the medial lemniscus tract, these are the axons of the second order neurons traveling up to the thalamus where they're synapsing on their respective third order neurons and then transmitting that sensory information to the area of the cortex that's going to be responsible for that particular body part. Excuse me. So the second ascending pathway is the spinothalamic pathway, which is the one on the far right that you see over here. And so these include both the lateral and the ventral spinothalamic tracts. And the goal of the spinothalamic pathway is to transmit sensations like pain and temperature and coarse touch and pressure impulses within this spinothalamic, lateral spinothalamic tract. And so here's the example where you have a temperature receptor being stimulated. It's going to enter the spinal cord. Notice that it's entering on the right side here. But when it synapses, notice that we have this crossover occurring where the second order neuron crosses over from the right side of the spinal cord to the left side of the spinal cord, where it then travels up to the brain and synapses on the left cortex, left side of the primary somatosensory cortex, even though these sensations came from the right side of the body. Okay, so just notice crossing over is happening here in the spinothalamic pathway. And so this idea of decussation is occurring in this spinothalamic pathway at the level that the first order neuron comes in. Okay, so what we should be noticing here, so at this point, so first order neuron is entering for the spinothalamic pathway. First order neuron is entering the spinal cord at whatever level that nerve comes from. So if we're talking about the hand, it's going to enter, up towards the thoracic region. If we're talking about the foot, then this is going to be maybe in the lumbar region. And immediately, as it's going to synapse on its second order neuron, which the second order neuron is going to be the one that's doing the decussation, the crossing over to the opposite side of the central nervous system. When we compare this with the dorsal column pathway, we notice that the dorsal column pathway, the sensation might actually travel up a bit first. So its first order neurons are going to be a lot longer when you compare it with the spinothalamic pathway. These first order neurons over here in the dorsal pathway, they're much longer because they don't actually synapse on the second order neuron until it reaches the medulla. Okay, and that's the point. The second order neuron is going to cross over onto the opposite side of the body. Okay, so that's just something to note, that there's a difference between those two where crossing over is occurring. And then finally is the spinocerebellar pathway. And these are ventral and dorsal tracts that are going to terminate in the cerebellum. And remember, the cerebellum is our mini brain. And spinal cerebellar tracts convey information about muscle or tendon stretch to the cerebellum, which helps to coordinate muscle activity. And so in this particular pathway, we notice that our primary neuron is, our first order neuron is going to come in to the level of the spinal cord at which that particular muscle would be innervated. And it's going to synapse on its second order neuron. And the second order neuron is going to travel upwards with that sensory information and synapse on the cerebellum. And if you notice here, there is not crossing over that is occurring. There's no decussation that's occurring in the spinocerebellar tract. And also, if you notice, there are no third order neurons in this spinocerebellar tract. Okay, so that's something to note as well, is that there is no third order in this spinocerebellar tract. So here is a summary table of the different ascending pathways. And now we'll talk about the descending pathways. And remember, the descending pathways are the ones that are carrying motor information. So they deliver information from the brain out to the body. And we have two groups of descending pathways. We have either direct pathways, which are the pyramidal tracts, or we have indirect pathways, which are basically all the other ones. And in terms of the motor pathways involve two neurons. So we have upper motor neurons, which include the pyramidal cells that are in our primary motor cortex. And then we have lower motor neurons, and these lower motor neurons are the ones that would originate from the ventral horn of the spinal cord and go on to innervate skeletal muscle. So just to highlight upper motor versus lower motor neurons, we're going to take a look at this red line. Starting at the cerebrum, this is all an upper motor neuron, and it continues to be an upper motor neuron until it synapses clear down at the level of the spinal cord that the lower motor neuron is going to exit and innervate the muscle. Okay. So let's talk about these direct or pyramidal pathways. These direct pathways take information from the neurons in the precentral gyrus, pass through the pyramidal tracts. And so we have lateral tracts, and we also have ventral corticospinal pathways. And they descend directly without synapsing until the axon reaches the end of the track in the spinal cord. And in the spinal cord, this is when the axons are going to synapse with interneurons, if we're talking about the lateral tract, or the axons are going to send synapse with the ventral horn motor neurons if we're talking about the ventral tract. And so this pathway regulates really fast and fine skilled movements. So just to highlight these tracts so we can see them a little bit more closely, I guess is the best way to put it, is first I'll show you the ventral corticospinal tract. Okay, so that one's going to be starting up here in the cortex. This is all upper motor neuron traveling down through the different levels down to the target area, at which point this is when decussation is going to occur. It's going to cross over and synapse on its lower motor neuron. And then that lower motor neuron is going to exit the spinal cord and go out and innervate and synapse on the muscle.
Okay, so that's the ventral corticospinal tract. All right, and we call it that because you can see that it is synapsing in the ventral horn. Okay. The other tract that I will go through with you guys is going to be then the the lateral corticospinal tract. And the lateral corticospinal tract then is going to still start up in the cortex. It's going to travel down through the midbrain, through the cerebellum and the pons, down to the medulla, at which point it's going to reach the cervical spinal cord. And this is the area where it's going to cross over and start going through. Notice the region here. It's going to start going through this area where the lateral horn is located. Okay, and from here, it's going to continue to travel down until it reaches its prospective interneuron. Okay, so we're going to synapse here, and then we see the interneuron, right? So let me put that one in a different color. Here's our interneuron. And the interneuron is going to synapse then on the lower motor neuron, which will exit the spinal cord and go on to synapse on the target skeletal muscle. Okay. So this is a summary table then of the direct pyramidal pathways. And then the last descending pathway that I'm going to talk to you guys about is the indirect pathways, and these are multineuronal. So these are really complex pathways, and they're multisynaptic pathways, meaning they involve a lot of different synapses, and they include the brainstem's motor nuclei and all the motor pathways except the pyramidal pathways. And so these particular pathways are going to regulate axial muscles to maintain balance and posture. They are going to regulate muscles that control movement of our limbs, and also going to regulate head, neck, and eye movements that help to follow objects in our visual field. So when someone says like follow my finger and they like move it all around in front of your eyes, this particular tract is helping to regulate your eye movements, your head movements, and your neck movements that allow you to follow a person's finger. So the descending pathways, there's actually 4 major pathways. And so the reticulospinal one, the reticulospinal tract is going to help maintain balance by basically varying the tone or the contraction of various postural muscles. The vestibulospinal tract does the exact same thing as the reticulospinal tract. So we talked about those. The rubrospinal tract is going to be the one that controls our flexor muscles. And the tectospinal tract is actually originating from the superior colliculi. And if you guys remember, that was in the midbrain, the superior colliculi, and tectospinal tract is going to mediate head movements in response to the visual stimuli. Okay, so that's the job of the tectospinal tract. So I have over here the rubrospinal tract just to show you the example. And so this is the one that controls the flexor muscles. Okay, and so the rubrospinal tract, for example, is going to originate here in the red nucleus of the midbrain. It's going to send its neuron down through the pons, through the medulla, until it reaches the cervical spine, at which point it's going to synapse on its interneuron. And then the interneuron is going to synapse on another neuron that's going to exit the spinal cord and go on and synapse on whatever muscle we're trying to control. So in this case, it'd be any of our flexor muscles. So here is a summary table of the major descending pathways and tracts. And just to kind of put this in perspective, this particular picture is of a diffusion tensor MRI. And so this is showing you all the different fiber tracts superimposed on one another that are in the brain and the spinal cord, really. So, I mean, you can just imagine all of these different tracts crossing over and interacting with one another. It's really quite amazing to see this visually. So the last thing we're going to discuss then is spinal cord injuries, diseases, and disorders. So let's first talk about spinal cord trauma. Trauma to the spinal cord, any kind of localized injury to the spinal cord or it's to its roots is going to lead to some kind of loss of function. And so there's a couple different terms that we need to differentiate. And so the term paresthesia refers to a condition that can be caused by damage to the dorsal roots or to those sensory tracts, and that leads to a sensory function lost. If we're talking about paralysis, though, paralysis refers to damage that can be caused to either the ventral roots or the ventral horns, and this is a motor function loss. And we have two types of paralysis, both flaccid and spastic. And so right off the bat, what you guys should be thinking is paresthesia is a sensory issue. Paralysis is a motor issue. So I said that there's two types of paralysis. We have flaccid paralysis and spastic paralysis. So flaccid paralysis is when there is severe damage to either the ventral root or to the ventral horn cells, so at the level of the spinal cord. And so in flaccid paralysis, remember this is a motor problem, paralysis is, the impulses don't reach the muscles, and so because of this, we have no control, no voluntary or involuntary control of the muscles. And due to this, the muscles begin to atrophy. So basically the muscles can't contract at all and the muscle will stay weak and floppy in flaccid paralysis. Okay, so flaccid paralysis, muscles can't contract, and so we're going to have a weak and a floppy muscle. In spastic paralysis, though, this is an instance in which there's damage to upper motor neurons of the primary motor cortex, right? So spastic paralysis, the damage happened in the brain. And so our spinal neurons are going to remain intact. So the muscles are going to be stimulated by reflex activity. And so in spastic paralysis, we don't have voluntary control over the muscles. And so the muscles are often going to shorten permanently. So this causes just like random muscle contraction. And sometimes that contraction, the muscle will just eventually just become stuck in that contracted phase. So next we'll talk about any kind of plegias. So transection, which basically means cutting through the spinal cord at any level, can result in a total motor and sensory loss in regions that are below that cut. So for example, we're going to start up here at a C4 injury. So if you have some sort of injury to the neck at the level of the fourth cervical vertebra, some kind of crush injury that cuts through the spinal cord, this is going to result in tetraplegia, also called paraplegia, quadriplegia. So Let me write that down so you guys don't get confused. Tetraplegia is the same thing as quadriplegia. Okay, so any injury, again, that would occur to, say, C4 or maybe even C6 is going to result in total loss of motor and sensory functions in everywhere below that level of the injury. If the injury occurs at T6, for example, the sixth thoracic vertebra, if there's some kind of injury that occurs here that ends up cutting the spinal cord in any way, this results in paraplegia, okay? And so paraplegia, anywhere the spinal cord is cut between T1 and L1 will result in paraplegia, okay? Oops, sorry about that. So again, anywhere that the spinal cord is injured between T1 and L1, this whole area will result in paraplegia. Any injury that's occurring at the cervical level will result in tetraplegia, also known as quadriplegia, okay? The next disease that I'm going to talk about is polio, also called poliomyelitis. And in polio, the ventral horns of motor neurons are destroyed by poliovirus. And because of this, the muscles begin to atrophy. And if this goes on and is not treated, then death can occur because eventually this reaches the level where of the neuron that innervates the diaphragm, and the diaphragm is required for breathing, or it can lead to cardiac arrest. Okay, and so essentially what is happening here is that we have a viral infection. Say you drink contaminated water. Okay, so some virus is going to pass maybe from the intestines into the feces and contaminate water. All right, and say you live in a poor community that uses that water as your drinking water. So you drink the water. And what's going to happen next is that the virus is going to replicate in the stomach and in the intestines. It can then enter the bloodstream. And by entering the bloodstream, it can then eventually reach the spinal cord. And at the level of the spinal cord, the poliovirus is actually going to sit on these anterior horn cells or the ventral horn cells and start destroying them. Okay, and because this is a motor area important for executing functions of your muscles, that means these nerves are now damaged, and so now your muscles don't work properly. And so nerve cell damage can cause muscle paralysis in the legs, the abdomen, the thorax, or the brainstem, and can even lead to death. And something interesting about this is that survivors of polio, so even if you get treated and you survive, you might develop post-polio syndrome, which can occur many years later from neuron loss. And the only prevention against poliovirus is a vaccination. The next disease we'll talk about is ALS, or amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. This is also called Lou Gehrig's disease, and this occurs when the ventral horns or the anterior horns and the fibers of the pyramidal tract are destroyed. And so some of the symptoms of this would be like loss of the ability to speak, swallow, and breathe. Death usually occurs within 5 years of the diagnosis and first onset of symptoms. And usually this disease we believe is to be caused by environmental factors and also genetic mutations. And specifically, Lou Gehrig's disease, or ALS, involves glutamate excitotoxicity. Okay, so involves glutamate excitotoxicity. There is a drug called Riluzole, which interferes with the glutamate signaling, and that's the only treatment. But again, this is not a cure, it's just a treatment to manage the symptoms. And so I put a picture over here of Stephen Hawking, because he famously was diagnosed with ALS. And that's a wrap. So that is the entire unit on the spinal cord portion of the central nervous system. And I believe we will reconvene next week and start talking about the peripheral nervous system, which will build off of the information that we just learned in the central nervous system section.